Not too long ago, Canada and the United States were like friendly neighbors, sharing values, trading goods, and working together on global issues. But recently, that close bond has started to unravel, and fast. It all began when President Trump made a surprise move. He slapped a heavy 25% tax on Canadian imports. His reasons? He blamed everything from immigration concerns to illegal fentanyl trafficking, though most experts agreed those claims didn't really add up. Regardless of the reasoning, it felt like a slap in the face to Canada. Naturally, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau wasn't going to just sit back and take it. He fired back with tariffs of his own and stood in front of the country, calmly but clearly criticizing the US move as unfair and harmful. What had once been a friendly rivalry was suddenly starting to feel like a real conflict. As if trade tensions weren't enough, things took a bizarre turn when Trump started floating the idea of annexing Canada, literally making it the 51st state of America. At first, people laughed it off. Surely he was joking. But after he repeated the idea several times, the mood changed. What once seemed like a wild comment was now being taken more seriously, and people were worried. Behind the scenes, the Canadian government was working overtime to figure out what was really going on. Trudeau later acknowledged that much of the pressure seemed to come from US interest in Canada's vast natural resources, everything from clean water and forests to critical minerals. This wasn't just about politics anymore, it was about power and control. In response, Canada started looking elsewhere. The government began strengthening ties with Europe and Asia, working on new trade agreements and security partnerships. The idea was simple. If the US could no longer be relied on, then Canada needed to diversify its relationships. At the same time, something was happening on the ground. A wave of pride and nationalism began to rise. Regular Canadians were standing up, saying, "Enough is enough." That's when the Elbows Up movement was born, a grassroots show of resistance against what people saw as American overreach. It wasn't just about policies, it was about identity and sovereignty. Then, in a stunning turn of events, Prime Minister Trudeau resigned. His decision shook the nation. Stepping into the spotlight was Mark Carney, a respected economist and former central banker. Carney quickly called for early elections and promised to protect Canada's economy and independence no matter what. Meanwhile, Foreign Minister Melanie Joly offered a warning that echoed far beyond Canada's borders. She said Canada might be the canary in the coal mine, the first sign of trouble for other countries facing unpredictable US leadership. Her message was clear. This wasn't just about one country, it was about a changing global order. As tensions deepened, Canada began turning its attention to national defense. Within days, it had launched major plans to strengthen both its air and naval forces. And right on cue, something caught everyone's eye. A powerful French submarine, the FS Tourville, quietly docked in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Sleek, silent, and nuclear-powered, it wasn't just passing through. Its mission was to conduct cold water performance tests and, more importantly, to showcase what France could offer if Canada wanted to upgrade its aging fleet. This was no ordinary submarine. The Tourville is part of France's elite Barracuda program, a new class of stealthy, high-tech subs built for long missions and intelligence gathering. Its visit was more than symbolic, it was strategic, and people noticed. Locals came down to the harbor to snap photos and ask questions, while defense analysts watched closely. Was this a sign that Canada was moving away from relying on the US for military support? Many believed it was, and that belief was backed by numbers. The Royal Canadian Navy soon announced a massive 60 billion Canadian dollar investment, roughly $42 billion in US currency, to completely renew its submarine fleet. The goal was to boost Canada's strength in the Arctic and other key areas where the stakes are rising fast. All of this comes after Canada and France signed a joint agreement in 2024 to deepen their defense partnership. What began as a signature on paper is now turning into real cooperation at sea. So, while Canada and the US may still share a long border and many cultural ties, the reality on the ground is changing. Canada is standing taller, building new alliances, and preparing for a future where it has to be more self-reliant than ever before. What started as a trade dispute has become something much bigger, a defining moment in Canada's story, and the world is watching. Something big is changing in Canada, something that could reshape how the country protects itself and who it chooses to trust. It's not happening with fireworks or dramatic headlines, but with quiet, bold decisions that speak volumes about the future Canada is planning for. Lately, Canada has been taking a long, hard look at its defense strategy. For decades, the country leaned heavily on its closest neighbor, the United States, when it came to military technology, security partnerships, and strategic planning. The two countries shared radar systems, fighter jet programs, and even defense missions under organizations like NORAD. But now, things feel different. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney recently made a bold announcement. Canada is spending around 6 billion Canadian dollars, that's about 4.2 billion in US dollars, on a new radar system, one that doesn't come from the US at all. This high-tech system is called Over-the-Horizon Radar, and it's based on technology developed in Australia, known as JORN, the Jindalee Operational Radar Network. So, what's so special about this radar? Unlike regular radar that can only see things in a straight line, the JORN uses the Earth's atmosphere to bounce signals way beyond the horizon, up to 3,000 kilometers away. That means it can watch the skies and oceans over Canada's enormous Arctic territory in real time, even if there are no people or radar towers nearby. This is a huge deal, especially since the Arctic is getting more attention globally as ice melts and new routes and resources open up. Carney made it clear, Canada is an Arctic nation and it's going to protect its north. During a visit to Nunavut, he stood before a crowd and said, "Arctic sovereignty is a strategic priority of our government. Canada is and forever will be an Arctic nation." His words weren't just for show, they were a signal to the world that Canada is stepping up, with or without the US by its side. Part of this shift comes from growing friction between Canada and the current US administration. President Trump has taken some surprising steps in recent months, talking about annexing Canada, putting tariffs on Canadian exports, and pushing a more aggressive tone with longtime allies. All of that has made Canadian leaders rethink how much they should rely on a partner that seems increasingly unpredictable. And the radar system is only one piece of the puzzle. Canada is also planning to build between 6 and 12 brand new submarines, massive, powerful vessels that can patrol the deep seas and help protect Canadian waters. The first of these subs could be ready by 2035, but the decision on who gets to build them will come much sooner, likely by 2028. One of the companies in the running is the French naval group that built the FS Tourville, a nuclear-powered submarine that recently made a stop in Halifax, Nova Scotia. That visit wasn't just a friendly drop-in, it was a showcase. France was showing Canada what it could offer, and judging by the attention it got, people were definitely watching. At the same time, other defense upgrades are happening too. Ultra Maritime, a defense company, just signed a deal worth nearly 89 million Canadian dollars to provide torpedo defense systems for Canada's River-class destroyers. These upgrades will make the Navy's surface ships safer and more modern, helping Canada stay ready in an increasingly uncertain world. And it's not just ships and radar. There's talk in Ottawa of backing out of a major deal with the United States, the one to buy 88 F-35 fighter jets. The original plan, signed in June 2023, would have cost Canada around $19 billion. The government has already paid for the first 16 jets, set to arrive next year. But now, officials are asking, do we really need all 88 of them? Or can we look elsewhere for planes that suit Canada's needs better? Defense Minister Bill Blair hinted at a possible change just hours after he was reappointed to Carney's cabinet. He said the government is actively exploring alternatives, which means they might walk away from the US jets altogether. That's a huge shift, especially considering how tied in Canada's military has been with American equipment for so long. And this isn't just a Canadian issue. Just days before, Portugal announced it was canceling its own F-35 order. Their defense minister, Nuno Melo, explained that rising concerns about Trump's foreign policy and how it could affect NATO allies played a big role in their decision. They worried that if relations got worse, the US might limit access to parts or support for the planes, making them risky investments. If more countries follow Portugal's lead, the F-35 might not be the future of air defense everyone once thought it would be. All of this adds up to one big idea. Canada is rethinking who it partners with, how it protects itself, and what it means to be truly independent. No longer content to just follow the lead of its bigger neighbor, Canada is quietly building a new path, one that puts its own needs, its own land, and its own people first. These are not small moves. They're careful, calculated steps toward a future where Canada stands a little taller, a little more prepared, and a whole lot more in control of its own destiny. And while the headlines might be about submarines, radar, or fighter jets, the story underneath it all is about something bigger. A country learning to speak for itself and making sure it's ready for whatever comes next. Let's take a little journey through time and explore how Canada's military grew from a small group of local helpers into one of the most respected armed forces in the world. Way back in the early days, long before Canada was even a country, there wasn't really a Canadian military the way we think of it today. Instead, people protected their communities with whatever they had. If there was a threat, local settlers would grab their hunting rifles, gather their neighbors, and stand together to defend their towns. These were farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, regular folks who volunteered to form militias. They didn't wear matching uniforms, and they definitely weren't trained like modern soldiers, but they were brave and determined. These militias first came together in the 1600s and 1700s, during the time when French and British settlers were fighting over land in what would one day become Canada. Their job? Defend their homes from rival colonial powers, angry uprisings, or attacks from other groups trying to claim the land. They played important roles in battles like the 7 Years' War, where they helped the British push out the French and redraw the map of North America. One of the most famous moments in early Canadian military history happened during the War of 1812. Back then, the United States tried to invade British North America, which would later become Canada. But the militias didn't back down. Alongside British soldiers and indigenous warriors, many led by the legendary leader Tecumseh, they pushed back American forces again and again. It was one of the first times people on this land really started thinking of themselves as more than just British subjects. They were becoming something new, Canadians. After Canada officially became a country in 1867, things started changing. The British Army, which had always been around to help out, slowly pulled out. By 1871, there were no more British troops stationed in Canada. That meant the new nation had to stand on its own 2 feet when it came to defense. So, Canada got to work building a military of its own. First, in 1876, the government created the Royal Military College in Kingston, Ontario. This school trained young Canadians to become military officers, kind of like teachers for future soldiers. A few years later, in 1883, Canada formed its first permanent army units, the Infantry School Corps and the Cavalry School Corps. These weren't part-time militias anymore. They were full-time soldiers, and this marked the beginning of a professional Canadian army. It didn't take long for this new army to be put to the test. In 1885, the government sent troops to deal with the Northwest Rebellion, a conflict led by Louis Riel and the Métis people, who were fighting for their land and rights. The campaign was controversial and heartbreaking, but it showed that Canada now had a military force capable of responding to serious national events without needing help from Britain. Then came the First World War, and everything changed. When war broke out in 1914, Canada was still part of the British Empire, so it joined the fight right away. More than 600,000 Canadians signed up to fight overseas, an enormous number for a country that only had around 8 million people at the time. Over 60,000 of them never came home. Canadian soldiers became known for their courage and skill. At the Battle of Vimy Ridge in 1917, they did what others had failed to do: take control of a key position in France. That victory didn't just help win the war, it helped shape Canada's identity. People started seeing Canada as its own proud nation, not just a smaller piece of Britain. Only a couple of decades later, the world was at war again. When World War II broke out in 1939, Canada once again stepped up, this time as an independent country. Over 1 million Canadians served in the Army, Navy, and Air Force. They fought in important battles like the invasion of Sicily, the D-Day landings in Normandy, and the liberation of the Netherlands. Canadian ships helped keep the Atlantic safe from enemy submarines, and the Royal Canadian Navy became the third largest navy among the Allies by the end of the war. Canada also played a huge role in training pilots for the war. Through a massive program called the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, Canada trained pilots from all over the world to fly and fight. The skies above the prairies were buzzing with aircraft as young men learned to fly missions that would take them across oceans and into danger. When the war finally ended, Canada didn't just pack up and go home. Instead, it stepped into a new role, helping keep peace around the world. In 1949, Canada became one of the founding members of NATO, a military alliance of countries that promised to defend each other. Soon after, Canada sent troops to fight in the Korean War, standing side by side with other allies to stop the spread of conflict in Asia. After that, Canada took on peacekeeping missions, helping to settle conflicts in places like Cyprus, the Congo, and the Balkans. These peacekeeping roles became something Canada was known for, wearing blue helmets, helping rebuild war-torn communities, and trying to be a calm voice in troubled places. Today, Canada's armed forces are a unified team made up of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. They work both at home and overseas, training with allies, helping with disaster relief, and responding to emergencies. While they're smaller than some other countries' militaries, they're well-trained, well-respected, and deeply committed to protecting the people and land they serve. From ragtag militias with muskets to high-tech aircraft and submarines, the journey of Canada's military has been long and full of challenges. But each chapter has helped shape the country into what it is today, a strong, independent nation ready to face the future with courage, just like those early volunteers did hundreds of years ago. Let's talk about Canada's military, how it's grown, changed, and where it might be headed next. A long time ago, Canada's military was split into 3 parts: the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force. Each one had its own name, uniforms, leaders, and way of doing things. But in 1968, the Canadian government decided to shake things up. Instead of having 3 separate branches doing their own thing, they decided to combine everything into one big team called the Canadian Armed Forces, or CAF for short. It was a bold idea. The person behind it was Paul Hellyer, who was Canada's Minister of National Defence at the time. He thought that if everyone worked together under one system, it would save money, cut down on confusion, and help the military work more smoothly. Not everyone liked the idea at first. Some people missed the old traditions. But over time, this new setup helped Canada build a military that was more united, flexible, and ready for anything. One person who really helped shape Canada's modern military image was Lester B. Pearson. He believed in peacekeeping, sending Canadian troops to help calm conflicts and support communities around the world without picking sides. Thanks to leaders like him, Canada earned a reputation for being a country that not only stood up for itself, but also stepped in to help others. As the world changed, so did Canada's military. It started using better technology, teaming up with international allies, and joining missions that ranged from battling terrorism to delivering food and aid after natural disasters. Canadian troops were sent to places like Afghanistan, Haiti, and Ukraine. They didn't just fight, they rebuilt schools, helped communities, and provided emergency care. Today, the Canadian Armed Forces include around 68,000 active duty members and another 27,000 reservists, people who train part-time and can be called in when needed. That total includes about 5,000 Canadian Rangers who live and work in remote areas, especially in the far north, and know the land better than anyone. To make sure the military keeps growing, Canada has set a goal. They want to recruit almost 6,500 new full-time members this year alone. And by the time 2032 rolls around, the target is to have 71,500 regular force members and 30,000 reserves. Getting more people to join isn't easy. That's why they're trying to make the process faster, simpler, and more welcoming for people from all walks of life. The idea is to build a military that looks more like Canada itself, diverse, smart, and full of people with unique skills and stories. Of course, making a strong military takes money. For the year 2024 to 2025, Canada's defense budget is expected to reach 1.37% of the country's total economy, what experts call the GDP. That's a bit more than last year when it was 1.31%. A big chunk of this money, over 18%, is going toward buying new equipment like ships, planes, and advanced tech. That's up from about 15% the year before. Canada's Navy has a big job. With thousands of kilometers of coastline touching the Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic Oceans, they need to patrol huge areas of ocean, rescue people in trouble, and keep watch for anything suspicious. Their ships, including frigates, submarines, and supply vessels, also travel around the world, joining up with allies like NATO for training and missions. The Army, which is the largest part of the CAF, takes care of defense on land. Soldiers are trained to handle everything from protecting Canadian territory to helping out during floods, wildfires, and other emergencies. They also travel abroad to help with peacekeeping, combat missions, and humanitarian work. The Air Force covers the skies. Whether it's flying fighter jets, helicopters, or transport planes, the Royal Canadian Air Force keeps watch from above. They help during search and rescue operations, move troops and supplies, and keep an eye on Canadian airspace. And when it comes to watching the skies over all of North America, they work closely with the United States through NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. Now, speaking of the United States, Canada and the US have had one of the closest military friendships in the world. They've shared equipment, plans, and missions for decades. They've protected each other's skies, helped each other during disasters, and worked side by side around the world. But lately, that relationship has started to feel a little rocky. Over the past few months, political tensions have started to grow, especially with US President Trump taking a more aggressive tone. He's pushed new taxes on Canadian goods and even made strange comments about making Canada part of the United States. As you can imagine, that didn't go over well in Ottawa. Because of this, Canada is starting to rethink how much it depends on the US, especially when it comes to defense. One big example: the government is now thinking about canceling its contract to buy a fleet of F-35 fighter jets from an American company. This was a big deal when it was signed. The F-35s are some of the most advanced planes in the world, and the deal was worth billions. But now, with tensions rising and worries about being too dependent on one supplier, Canada is asking, is this still the right move? Other countries are wondering the same thing. Portugal recently pulled out of its own plan to buy F-35s, citing political uncertainty in the US and concerns about how reliable future support for the jets might be. So, what does this all mean? It means Canada is starting to look for new partners. It wants to build a stronger, more independent military, one that works with others but doesn't rely too heavily on any one country. It means modern ships, new aircraft, better tech, and smarter planning. And it means welcoming a new generation of Canadians into the military, ready to protect the country in whatever way the future demands. Whether it's helping during wildfires, guarding the Arctic, rescuing people lost at sea, or training with allies around the globe, the Canadian Armed Forces are getting ready, not just for today, but for whatever comes next. For a long time, Canada and the United States have worked side by side, especially when it comes to keeping North America safe. They've trained together, shared information, planned missions, and guarded the skies through programs like NORAD, which protects both countries from threats in the air. But now, things aren't quite as smooth as they used to be. Lately, the relationship between the two countries has been showing signs of strain. It's not completely broken, but it's clearly shifting. And that shift could have big consequences, not just for Canada and the US, but for the way both nations deal with defense, security, and global partnerships moving forward. If trust continues to weaken, even something as important as NORAD could be affected. That would make it harder to coordinate defenses and respond quickly if a threat appears. It could also slow down joint training, limit how much intelligence is shared, and make teamwork during missions more complicated than it needs to be. This tension doesn't just stay on the battlefield either, it spills over into the economy. Canada's defense industry is tightly connected to the US through special agreements. Like Canadian companies help build parts for American equipment and vice versa. If that cooperation fades, it could lead to fewer contracts, less access to US markets, and fewer opportunities for Canadian defense workers. In response, Canada may begin looking to build stronger partnerships with countries in Europe and the Indo-Pacific region, and that's already starting to happen. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada is slowly but surely taking a more independent path. The government is strengthening its ties with new partners overseas and investing in technology and tools that it can build and control itself. It's not about cutting off old friendships. It's about being ready for a world where not everything is guaranteed. Foreign Minister Melanie Joly said it clearly. Canada might be the canary in the coal mine, the early sign that other countries should pay attention to. If Canada is feeling the pressure of unpredictable US policies, there's a good chance others will too. Right now, the military partnership with the US still exists, but it's clear that things are no longer the same. For Canada, this could be the start of a major change in direction, a realignment of its defense strategy. The focus going forward seems to be on being less dependent, more self-reliant, and better prepared for whatever comes next. It's about protecting Canada's sovereignty, building strong defenses at home, and making sure the country isn't caught off guard by sudden shifts in international politics. There's a lot to think about. Do you think this shift is the right move? Should Canada continue building its independence or double down on repairing its bond with the US? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's hear what you think.